The day 3 Alpha Kings chose their crowns over their Omega, the whole capital rang with celebration, but Elias Whitmore heard only one thing in those bells: the sound of a door closing forever. The grand hall had never looked more perfect. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows in streams of blue, gold, and white, turning the marble floor into a river of color. Above the 3 thrones hung the banners of 3 kingdoms that had spent generations bleeding against one another. The Black Wolf of the North, the Silver Star of the East, the White Rose of the West. Outside, thousands of citizens filled the royal square, cheering for peace, unity, and the beginning of a reign everyone had been taught to believe would save them. Inside, Elias stood behind the thrones in white ceremonial robes, hands folded, face calm, heart quietly breaking. Once, people had called him the heart of the 3 kingdoms. Once, servants smiled when he passed. Once, nobles lowered their voices with wonder when Adrian Blackwell, Caleb Ashford, and Julian Everhart looked at him as if the world made more sense because he was in it. Now no one met his eyes. Advisors stopped speaking when he entered a corridor. Council members treated his presence like a mistake that had not yet been corrected. Even the kind servants had learned to show him warmth only when no one important was watching. Political cruelty rarely arrived with a raised voice. It arrived dressed in silk, carrying documents, speaking gently enough to make betrayal sound like wisdom. Elias had learned that lesson during the longest year of his life. Across the hall stood the 3 men he had loved. Adrian Blackwell, the soon-to-be King of the North, wore a dark military uniform trimmed in silver. He looked cold enough to make every general proud, but Elias remembered the man who had once knelt in snow for 2 hours to help him rescue an injured hawk because Elias could not bear to leave it behind. Caleb Ashford, the soon-to-be King of the East, stood with a stack of papers in his hands and advisors at his shoulder. He looked brilliant, composed, untouchable, but Elias remembered the man who used to sneak out of strategy meetings to meet him in the observatory, where they named stars and spoke about a future that did not require anyone to hide. Julian Everhart, the soon-to-be King of the West, greeted dignitaries with the gentle smile his people adored. He remembered names, birthdays, old griefs, and small stories others forgot, but today he had not looked at Elias for more than a heartbeat. That hurt most of all. Elias understood what the court wanted. For months, the whispers had sharpened around him. 1 Omega should not stand beside 3 rulers. 1 beloved person should not influence 3 crowns. 1 heart could become a weakness. The accusations always arrived as questions. Which kingdom would Elias favor if the kings disagreed? What if foreign enemies used him? What if the people trusted him more than the throne? The questions were never asked to find truth. They were asked because fear needed language before it could become law. Then the doors of the grand hall opened, and every conversation died. 12 members of the Royal Council entered in black ceremonial robes, led by Lord Harrington, the oldest and most dangerous man in the capital. His hair was white, his steps were slow, and his voice was always soft. That was what made people forget how many lives he had rearranged with a signature. In his hand he carried a sealed decree. Elias felt the room change before anyone spoke. Adrian's shoulders went rigid. Caleb's fingers tightened around his papers. Julian's smile disappeared. They knew. Of course they knew. The wound had been prepared before Elias ever entered the hall. Harrington stopped before the thrones and bowed. Before the coronation proceeds, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, the council must address a matter concerning the stability of the United Kingdoms. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Elias. Outside, the people kept cheering. Inside, Elias felt alone enough to hear his own breathing. Harrington broke the seal. The council has received formal petitions from noble houses, military leaders, and foreign allies expressing concern regarding Lord Elias Whitmore's future role within the United Reign. His personal bond with all 3 incoming kings has created uncertainty among the territories. Therefore, the council advises that Lord Elias withdraw from public royal affairs until a permanent arrangement can be determined. Permanent arrangement. Elias almost smiled. Exile always sounded cleaner when powerful men refused to say the word. The hall waited for the kings. 1 word from Adrian could have ended it. 1 sentence from Caleb could have exposed the manipulation. One step from Julian could have reminded the court that Elias was not a problem to be managed. Elias looked at Adrian first. The Northern Alpha stared forward, expression carved from stone, but Elias knew him too well. He saw the tension near his mouth. He saw the fight behind his eyes. Adrian was not indifferent. That almost made it worse. Caleb looked at the decree as if the cruelty inside it could be solved by studying the wording long enough. Julian looked toward the windows, where sunlight trembled across the white rose banner. No one spoke. The silence stretched until it became an answer. Harrington lowered the decree with the faintest trace of satisfaction. "Your Majesties," he said, though none of them had been crowned yet, "the council requests clarity before the oaths are sworn." Something inside Elias became very still. Not dead. Not empty. Still. It was the moment a heart stopped begging and began remembering its own worth. Caleb spoke first. "The unity of the kingdoms must remain our highest priority." The sentence was perfect. Wise. Empty. The council nodded. Adrian followed, his voice colder than the marble beneath them. "Personal attachments cannot be allowed to endanger the crown." Several nobles exhaled, as if cowardice had just saved them. Julian stayed silent the longest. Elias's foolish heart waited even then. Julian had always been the one who noticed pain first. Julian had once held Elias's hand beneath a summer sky and whispered, "If I ever forget what matters, remind me." Elias was reminding him now with his eyes. Julian finally looked at him. For one breath, every mask fell away. Elias saw shame, fear, love. Then Julian lowered his gaze. "The council's concerns will be respected," he said. 4 words. 4. Quiet words that made the entire hall relax. The kings had chosen. The council had won. The coronation could continue. Elias understood then that he had not lost them in that room. He had lost them long before he walked into it. The ceremony resumed with music, applause, and gold. That was the cruelest part. Betrayal did not stop the world. The bells still rang. The citizens still cheered. The crowns still arrived on velvet cushions. Adrian knelt first. When the northern crown touched his head, the hall erupted. He rose looking every inch the ruler his people wanted, strong, disciplined, unshakable. Only Elias noticed the way his hand curled once against his knee before he stood. Caleb came next. The eastern crown, delicate and sharp with silver points, settled onto his dark hair. Diplomats smiled. Advisors bowed. Caleb accepted praise with a calm face and haunted eyes. Julian was last. The western crown gleamed with stones shaped like roses. When it touched his head, the applause became thunder. Julian smiled for the crowd, and the crowd loved him for it. Elias watched from behind the thrones and remembered a boy on a pier, lanterns drifting across the ocean, a promise spoken so softly it had felt stronger than law. Some promises did not die loudly. Some stood in beautiful rooms and watched themselves become impossible. After the final oath, Harrington addressed the court again. "With the unity of the kingdom secured, further decisions regarding Lord Elias Whitmore shall be handled privately. Privately. Without him. For him. Around him. Never with him." Elias looked at the 3 kings one last time. Adrian did not turn. Caleb's mouth parted as if he wanted to speak, but Harrington stepped closer, and the moment vanished. Julian's eyes shone with grief, but grief without action was just another form of abandonment. Elias reached to his collar and removed the silver pin Julian had given him 3 years earlier, a white rose surrounded by 3 small stones, black, blue, and white. A symbol of belonging. A symbol of home. He held it until the edges pressed into his palm. Then he placed it gently on the empty chair behind him and walked away. No one stopped him. That was the answer he had needed most. By evening, the palace had become a festival of light. Music poured through banquet halls. Glasses chimed. Nobles toasted unity with wine they had not paid for, and peace they had not earned. Elias stood in his chambers surrounded by years of memories and began to pack. Not dramatically. Not angrily. He did not tear letters or throw gifts into the fire. He folded practical clothes, chose 2 books, gathered his savings, and placed everything into one travel case. It surprised him how little a person needed after finally giving up the future that no longer wanted him. On the desk lay Caleb's old star charts. Beside the window sat a compass Adrian had once pressed into his hand before a northern journey. In a drawer, Elias found dried white petals from the first rose Julian had grown for him in the western garden. He touched each object once, not because he wished to keep it, but because some grief deserved a proper goodbye. Rain began after sunset, tapping softly against the windows while the celebration continued in distant halls. Near midnight, someone knocked. Elias froze. His first thought was Adrian. His second was Caleb. His third, despite everything, was Julian. He hated himself for hoping. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and Margaret entered instead. She was an elderly servant with silver hair, kind eyes, and a spine stronger than most nobles in the palace. She saw the packed case and did not ask a foolish question. "You are leaving?" Elias nodded. Margaret crossed the room and pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. It was heavy with coins. "No," Elias whispered. "I cannot take this." "You can't," she said. "And you will?" "Margaret, this is your savings." Her eyes softened. "Then let an old woman spend them on something worthwhile." Elias looked away because kindness hurt more than cruelty when he was barely holding himself together. Margaret touched his cheek with trembling fingers. "Do not let this palace teach you that you were small. Some of us remember what the kingdoms became when you arrived." After she left, Elias sat beside the window and listened to the rain blur the music into something distant and unreal. Another knock came an hour later. This time, a royal messenger delivered an official letter sealed with 3 crests. Elias opened it with dry eyes. By recommendation of the Royal Council and with the consent of the Crowns, Lord Elias Whitmore is advised to withdraw from public royal affairs until further notice. Consent of the Crowns. There it was. Not Harrington alone. Not the Council alone. Them. Elias folded the letter and placed it on the desk. Then he put on a dark cloak, picked up his case, and walked out of the room without looking back. The palace corridors were almost empty. Guards glanced at him, and then away. No one had been ordered to stop him because no one believed he would leave on his own. That was the mistake powerful people often made. They thought quiet people had no breaking point. At the main gate, Elias paused and looked back. Hundreds of windows glowed warm against the storm. Somewhere inside, 3 kings were dancing around the empty space where their courage should have been. Elias waited one breath. 2. 3. No footsteps came after him. No voice called his name. So he stepped beyond the gate and disappeared into the rain. Inside the palace, Adrian Blackwell stood alone on a balcony overlooking the capital. He had left the banquet early, claiming military reports required attention. In truth, he could not breathe in that hall. Every toast sounded like an accusation. Every cheer from the square reminded him of Elias's face when he said nothing. Adrian gripped the stone railing until his knuckles whitened. Behind him, Lord Harrington approached with the careful confidence of a man who believed victory had made him untouchable. "A difficult day, Your Majesty," Harrington said. Adrian did not turn. "Was it?" Harrington paused. "Necessary, then?" "Necessary," Adrian repeated. The word tasted like blood and metal. Earlier that morning, Harrington had shown him letters supposedly written by northern commanders. Each warned that rival territories would see Elias as Adrian's weakness. One letter carried the name of General Voss, the man who had trained Adrian after his father's death. A king led by affection can be led into ruin. Adrian had wanted to tear the letter in half. Instead, he had folded it and walked into the grand hall like a soldier walking toward an execution he had been told was duty. Harrington stepped beside him. "The North respects strength. You proved today that the crown cannot be bent by private longing." Adrian finally looked at him. "Do not mistake silence for agreement." Harrington bowed. "Of course, Your Majesty." He left quietly. Adrian remained on the balcony until rain soaked his sleeves. Only after midnight did he return to the grand hall where the throne stood empty. He found the silver pin on the chair behind Julian's throne. For several seconds he stared at it. Then he picked it up. The metal was cold. Adrian closed his fist around it and felt fear, real fear, colder than any battlefield. The palace had never felt this silent before. Caleb Ashford did not sleep that night. He sat in the Eastern Council chamber surrounded by trade maps, congratulation letters, and diplomatic reports. None of them made sense. His mind kept returning to Elias's face in the grand hall. Not angry. Not pleading. Calm. That calm haunted him. Anger would have given Caleb something to answer. Tears would have allowed him to feel useful. But Elias had looked at him as if a final door had closed from the inside. Lady Seraphine, his chief political adviser, entered near dawn. She had supported the council's recommendation from the beginning. "The foreign delegates are pleased," she said. "They believe the issue was handled with maturity." Caleb laughed once, without humor. "Is that what we call it now?" Her face remained composed. "We call it survival." She placed 3 letters on the table. "Before today, 5 allied houses were prepared to delay recognition of your reign. 2 trade coalitions had threatened withdrawal. Southern ambassadors questioned whether shared rule would become emotionally unstable before it began. You prevented that." Caleb looked at the letters. He had read them all before the ceremony. That was how the council had trapped him. Not with threats to himself, but with consequences for everyone else. If he defended Elias, the alliance might fracture. If the alliance fractured, border towns might suffer. If towns suffered, history would blame 3 kings who placed love above duty. Caleb had always believed intelligence meant seeing every outcome. Today, intelligence had become a cage. "Lord Elias will be safe," Seraphine added. "Comfortably settled, quietly protected, and far from public scrutiny." Caleb's eyes lifted. "He is not a document to be filed away." "No," she said gently. "He is a risk to be managed before others turn him into one." After she left, Caleb climbed to the observatory. Rain covered the glass dome, hiding the stars. Months ago, Elias had stood beside him there and asked whether Caleb ever got tired of predicting everything. Caleb had said no. Elias had smiled and answered, "Then one day I hope something surprises you gently." Caleb pressed his hand to the cold glass and whispered into the empty room, "I am sorry." But the person who needed to hear it was already gone. Julian Everhart stayed at the banquet longer than the others because everyone expected him to. He danced, thanked ambassadors, laughed at the right moments, and accepted compliments until his face ached from pretending. He searched for Elias in every doorway. Not near the balcony. Not beside the garden doors. Not in the corridor where he used to stand when court life became too much. Julian told himself Elias had gone to his rooms. Then he told himself Elias needed time. Then, when the lie became too thin, he walked to the west garden. Rain silvered the roses. The white blooms bowed beneath the weight of water. Julian remembered planting the first bush with Elias years ago. He had gotten mud on his sleeves, and Elias had laughed so hard Julian forgot to be embarrassed. "Your Majesty!" Harrington's voice came from behind him. Julian did not turn. "You should be celebrating." "I am tired." "You did well today." Julian shut his eyes. "Do not." Harrington's voice softened. "The people love you. That love makes you powerful, but it also makes you vulnerable. If you had opposed the council, they would have turned the court against Elias completely. This way, he can be protected quietly." Julian wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. Earlier that week, Harrington had shown him anonymous pamphlets already circulating through noble districts. They painted Elias as manipulative, ambitious, dangerous. Harrington warned that if Julian defended him too publicly, whispers would become open hatred. "Sometimes," Harrington had said, "the kindest choice is distance." Julian had accepted that sentence because it allowed him to feel noble while doing something cowardly. Now, standing in the rain, he understood the difference. Kindness chosen without the person it claims to protect is not kindness. It is control. Julian turned. "Where is Elias?" Harrington blinked. "In his chambers, I assume." Julian walked past him without another word. He reached Elias's rooms minutes later and found them empty. The travel case was gone. The gifts remained. The official letter lay on the desk. Julian read it once. Then again. His hands began to shake. He found the star charts, the compass, the dried roses, all the pieces of love Elias had left behind because carrying them would hurt more than losing them. Julian ran into the corridor. Find him, he ordered the nearest guard. Your Majesty? Find Lord Elias. Within the hour, the answer came. A gatekeeper had seen Elias leave alone in the rain shortly after midnight. No escort. No carriage. No destination. Julian stood in the entrance hall as the report was delivered. Adrian arrived moments later, still holding the silver pin. Caleb came from the observatory with rain in his hair and panic in his eyes. The three kings looked at one another, and for the first time since the coronation began, none of them had a mask strong enough to hide behind. He left, Julian said, voice breaking. Adrian's fist closed around the pin. Caleb whispered, because we let him. They sent riders before dawn. They searched the capital, the inns, the southern road, the river district, the gardens, every place Elias had ever loved. They found nothing. Harrington advised restraint. Seraphine warned against scandal. General Voss insisted the first week of rule could not be wasted chasing an Omega who had chosen to leave. Adrian nearly dismissed him on the spot. But kingdoms did not pause because hearts had been broken. Reports arrived. Petitions waited. Ambassadors demanded meetings. Border commanders required orders. The three kings were pulled into rule before they could understand the shape of their loss. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. On the surface, everything improved exactly as the council had promised. Trade agreements were signed. The Northern Army pledged loyalty. Eastern markets reopened. Western newspapers praised the new golden age. The council congratulated itself. Harrington smiled more often. Seraphine called it proof that painful choices could be wise. Voss called it discipline. But inside the palace, something began to rot quietly. Adrian noticed it first in the north. He had always trusted instinct. In councils and emergencies, his mind once moved like a blade, clean, fast, certain. Now every decision felt heavier. He snapped at officers, then apologized in private, which frightened them more than his anger. He kept the silver pin locked in his desk, then unlocked the drawer every morning as if pain required proof. One stormy dawn, Margaret entered with tea and found him staring at it. She said nothing. That was her gift and her punishment. Caleb deteriorated differently. He became more brilliant in public and more absent in private. He solved trade disputes with perfect language, then forgot to eat. He negotiated alliances, then climbed to the observatory and stood beneath stars he could no longer bear to name. His advisors praised his dedication. They did not see him unfold Elias's old notes in the margins of policy drafts. You forgot the fishing families near the eastern coast. This tax will hurt widows. Ask the village teachers what they need before building another military road. Caleb had once smiled at those comments, amused by Elias's stubborn compassion. Now he realized half his best policies had begun as Elias's quiet observations. Julian could not pretend at all. His people noticed first. The king who once walked city streets without warning stopped attending festivals. His smile became thinner. He forgot names and hated himself for it. In the western garden, the white roses bloomed, and he avoided them until Margaret finally stopped him one afternoon. They are only flowers, Your Majesty. Julian looked at the roses. No. They are witnesses. The kingdoms began to feel the loss before anyone dared name it. In the north, villages near the mountain passes reported winter shortages that should have been prevented. In the east, noble houses fought over old insults no one remembered starting. In the west, community leaders warned that old rivalries were returning beneath the language of unity. None of the problems were catastrophic alone. Together, they formed a pattern. The council blamed adjustment pains. Harrington blamed local incompetence. Voss blamed weakness among regional leaders. Seraphine blamed communication delays. Only Margaret, pouring tea in silent rooms and watching three kings age by years and months, understood the truth was simpler. A house built around a heart cannot pretend the heart was decoration. 6 months after the coronation, an elderly historian named Thomas Elric requested permission to address the Royal Council. Most advisors dismissed him. He had served the archives for 40 years and smelled constantly of dust, ink, and forgotten warnings. Adrian allowed him to speak because Adrian had begun distrusting anyone the council wanted silenced. Thomas placed an ancient book on the table. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellowed. "Your Majesties," he said, "the present instability may not be political." Harrington sighed. "Then what is it, superstition?" Thomas did not flinch. "Memory." Caleb leaned forward. Thomas opened the book to a painted page showing 3 crowned wolves standing around a single flame. In every era when the 3 kingdoms entered shared rule, records describe a person known as the heart of the realm. Not always royal. Not always an Omega. Not always a spouse. But always someone trusted by all rulers, beloved across borders, and able to hold emotional balance where law could not. Julian's face went pale. Adrian stopped moving. Thomas continued. "The heart does not rule. The heart reminds rulers why they rule. When the heart is honored, unity strengthens. When the heart is rejected, the crowns grow isolated. The records are clear." Harrington's voice sharpened. "Old poetry is not governance." "No," Thomas said. "But ignoring old warnings is not wisdom." He turned another page. 70 years ago, a shared reign nearly collapsed after the heart was removed from court by jealous advisors. The result was not immediate disaster. It began as exhaustion, mistrust, local unrest, failed harvest coordination, broken communication, and emotional decline among rulers. Does that sound familiar? No one answered. Thomas looked directly at the 3 kings. The council did not remove a scandal. It removed the bond that helped the kingdoms believe in one another. Harrington stood. "Enough." Adrian's voice cut through the room. "Sit down." Harrington froze. Slowly he sat. Caleb's voice was quiet. "Why was this hidden from us?" Thomas looked sad. "Because powerful people prefer systems they can control. A heart cannot be appointed by decree. A heart is recognized through love, trust, and service. That makes such a person inconvenient." Julian pressed a hand over his mouth. He was remembering Elias's notes about village schools, widows, bridges, clinics, children, names. Caleb remembered policy margins. Adrian remembered northern soldiers lowering their voices with respect when Elias visited wounded families after border storms. The truth did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like sunrise, revealing everything they had refused to see. Elias had not been a threat to unity. He had been one of the reasons unity existed at all. After the meeting, the 3 kings went separately to the archives. By morning, they had found enough proof to make denial impossible. Letters from past rulers. Journals from former queens. Records of shared reigns strengthened by a beloved central figure. Warnings underlined by dead hands: never mistake the bond that softens kings for weakness. A crown without a heart becomes a weight no ruler can bear for long. Adrian found the sentence in his father's old papers. Caleb found Elias's old policy notes, filed under informal suggestions, most adopted without credit. Julian found a wooden box in the garden shed. The gardener had kept it safe because Elias had asked him to. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes, not love letters, but records of people: a baker's daughter who needed medicine, a northern bridge that froze every winter, a school in Pine Hollow with no books, a widow in the east whose taxes had been calculated incorrectly, a coastal town that needed a clinic more than another statue. Elias had seen everything. He had cared before power noticed there was anything to care about. Julian sat on the garden floor with the notes spread around him and cried without sound. The next council session was not polite. Adrian entered first, wearing no ceremonial cloak, only the dark uniform of the North. Caleb came with documents stacked under one arm. Julian carried Elias's wooden box. Harrington looked irritated before he looked afraid. "Your Majesties," he began, "if this concerns yesterday's archive discussion, I strongly advise caution." Caleb placed the documents on the table. "You advised caution when you gave us selected letters before the coronation. I gave you relevant concerns. You gave us fear," Caleb said. Curated, sharpened, and timed. Adrian turned toward General Voss. And you told me my generals would question my strength if I defended Elias. I have since spoken to 4 of them. None wrote the letter you placed in my hand. Voss's face strained of color. Julian opened the wooden box and spread Elias's notes across the table. And you told me distance would protect him from public hatred. Yet several anonymous pamphlets used wording from private council memorandums. Harrington's silence became confession before his mouth could create denial. Seraphine lowered her eyes. She had not forged the trap, but she had helped decorate it with logic. You manipulated the succession, Caleb said. You turned our fear for the kingdoms against the person who helped hold them together. Harrington finally straightened. I protected the crowns. Adrian stepped forward. No. You protected your access to them. The room went still. Julian's voice was soft, but it carried farther than shouting. By sunset, every council member involved in this manipulation will resign or face public inquiry. The Omega Protection Statute will be drafted immediately. No companion, advisor, spouse, or bonded partner of the Crown will ever again be removed from public life without consent, representation, and direct hearing. Harrington stared at him. You would expose division during your first year? Caleb answered. We created division by hiding cowardice behind unity. Adrian placed the silver pin on the table. And we will spend the rest of our reign correcting it. That was the first consequence. Not enough. Never enough. But it was a beginning. Only after the council was broken did the search for Elias truly begin. This time, it was not hidden behind polite inquiries. The king sent riders openly with instructions that Elias Whitmore was not a fugitive, not a political asset, not a runaway embarrassment, but a beloved citizen whose safety mattered to the crown. They searched southern roads, coastal towns, monastery libraries, western villages where roses grew along stone walls. Weeks passed. Then months. Every false lead reopened the wound. Adrian grew quieter but not colder. Caleb stopped using intelligence as armor and began asking questions without assuming he knew the answers. Julian returned to public festivals, but every speech now included the people court life once ignored. They were becoming better, slowly and painfully, and that was the cruelest part of regret. Sometimes growth comes after the person who deserved it most has already left. Far from the capital, Elias lived under the name Eli in the mountain town of Pine Hollow. He arrived during a storm with a soaked cloak, a travel case, and no story he wished to tell. Pine Hollow was small enough that secrets were noticed but kind enough that they were not always demanded. The town sat between pine-covered hills and a cold river that flashed silver under morning light. Its schoolhouse leaned slightly to the left. Its main road turned muddy whenever it rained. Its people knew hardship without turning it into theater. Elias liked that. The widow who ran the bakery hired him first to repair shelves. Then the schoolteacher asked whether he knew how to read formal script. By winter, Elias was teaching children. In the mornings, helping repair fences in the afternoons, and writing letters for villagers who had family in distant towns at night. No one called him Lord. No one bowed. No one asked which king he loved most. They called him Eli, and somehow the smaller name gave him room to breathe. Healing did not happen quickly. Some mornings he woke reaching for a life that no longer existed. Some nights he dreamed of bells and crowns and 3 voices choosing duty with words that sounded like locked doors. But the pain changed shape. In the capital, grief had been a room with no windows. In Pine Hollow, it became weather. It came. It passed. It returned. It no longer owned the sky. Elias learned the names of children who interrupted lessons with questions about dragons. He helped an elderly shopkeeper rebuild a roof after heavy snow. He convinced the town council to repair the bridge before spring floods. He wrote to Margaret once using no return address, just enough to tell her he was alive. She wrote back through careful channels, sending no pressure, only news of palace reforms and 3 kings who no longer smiled easily. Elias read those letters by candlelight and felt emotions he did not know how to name. Relief. Sadness. Distance. Love, perhaps, but love with its hands open at last. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the coronation, Elias stood on the schoolhouse steps watching children race across the yard with paper crowns they had made for a history lesson. A little girl named Anna placed one on his head and declared him king of spelling because he was the only adult who could explain silent letters without getting annoyed. Elias laughed for the first time in days. Then the laughter faded. 3 riders appeared at the edge of town. Even before he saw their faces, his body knew them. Adrian rode first, posture straight but not proud. Caleb followed, thinner than before, eyes searching every street as if hope might vanish if he blinked. Julian came last, holding the reins loosely, his face open with a grief he no longer tried to hide. Pine Hollow slowed around them. Children stopped running. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Elias remained on the schoolhouse steps with a paper crown on his head and a strange calm in his chest. Adrian dismounted first. Then Caleb. Then Julian. For several seconds none of them spoke. They looked at Elias as if every mile they had traveled had not prepared them for the simple fact of him standing there alive, changed, and no longer waiting. Julian's voice broke first. Elias. The name moved through the square like a ghost. Elias carefully removed the paper crown and handed it to Anna. Go inside, sweetheart. The child looked between him and the king's with serious eyes. Are they trouble? Elias smiled faintly. Not today. When the children were inside, he stepped down into the square. You found me. Caleb looked as though those 3 words hurt more than anger would have. We have been searching for months. Elias nodded. I know. Adrian's eyes flickered. Margaret? She worries loudly through quiet letters. Julian almost smiled, then failed. Silence settled again. It was not empty this time. It was crowded with everything they had never said. Adrian stepped forward. The Northern King who had once made armies straighten with a glance now looked like a man standing before the only judgment that mattered. We were wrong. Elias looked at him. Yes. No softness. No cruelty. Just truth. Caleb swallowed. We let the council manipulate us. But that does not excuse what we chose. No, Elias said. It does not. Julian's eyes shone. We should have protected you. Elias held his gaze. You should have asked me what protection meant before deciding my life without me. Julian flinched, but he did not look away. That was new. A year ago, he would have drowned in shame. Now he stood inside it. Adrian reached into his coat and removed the silver pin Elias had left behind. I kept this. Elias stared at it. Memory moved through him, sharp and quiet. Why? Adrian's voice lowered. At first, because I could not let go. Later, because I needed to remember what cowardice cost. He held it out, not forcing Elias to take it. Elias did not. The pin remained between them like a small, shining history either of them could rewrite. Caleb unfolded a document. The council members responsible have been removed. Harrington is under inquiry. Voss resigned. Seraphine testified publicly and stepped down from court office. The Omega Protection Statute has passed in all 3 kingdoms. Elias listened, expression unreadable. Caleb continued, voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. We also reviewed your notes. The roads, clinics, schools, taxes, winter bridges. We built policies from your kindness and never gave you the respect of calling it wisdom. Elias looked toward the mountains. I did not write those notes for credit. I know, Caleb said. That is why you deserved it. Julian stepped forward last. The kingdoms are healing, but they still need you. Elias's face changed then. Not much. Only enough for all 3 kings to know they had made their first mistake of the reunion. That is the problem, he said softly. You crossed half the continent to tell me the kingdoms need me. But none of you began by asking what I need. The words landed harder than any accusation. Around them, Pine Hollow remained still. The bakery window was open. Somewhere inside the schoolhouse, a child whispered too loudly and was hushed by another. Adrian lowered his eyes. Caleb folded the document with shaking fingers. Julian looked as if the truth had struck him and he welcomed the pain because he deserved it. Then tell us, Adrian said. Please. Elias looked around the square. The leaning schoolhouse. The patched bakery roof. The muddy road he had helped drain. The children peeking through curtains. The mountains that had asked nothing from him except that he keep living. I need peace, he said. I need a life that belongs to me. I need to wake up without wondering which part of myself must be sacrificed so powerful people can feel stable. Caleb closed his eyes. Julian covered his mouth. Adrian nodded once, the movement stiff with pain. Then we will not ask you to return. Elias looked back at him, surprised despite himself. Adrian's jaw tightened. We wanted to. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But wanting something does not make it right. That was the first moment Elias felt the wall inside him shift. Not fall. Not open. Shift. Caleb placed the folded document back inside his coat. We brought proposals for Pine Hollow. A school charter, medical funding, road support. They are not payment. They are not persuasion. They are overdue attention to a town our maps barely named. Elias studied him carefully. And if I refuse? Then we leave the documents with the town council and remove our names from the dedication, Caleb said. The help stays. Our pride does not need to. Julian took a breath. I wrote a speech, he admitted. On the ride here. I thought if I found the perfect words, I could explain everything. A fragile smile touched his mouth. Then I saw you with the children, wearing a paper crown, and realized the perfect words would still be about my need to be forgiven. Elias's throat tightened. Julian continued. So I will only say this. I am sorry. Not because the kingdom suffered. Not because history named you heart of the realm. Not because losing you hurt us. I am sorry because you stood in a room full of people waiting to be chosen, and I looked away. Elias had imagined this apology many times. In the early weeks, he imagined it with anger. Later, with longing. Eventually, he stopped imagining it at all. Now that it had come, it did not repair the past. But it gave the past an honest name. Thank you, Elias said. Julian nodded, tears slipping silently down his face. They stayed in Pine Hollow for 3 days. Not in Elias's home. He did not invite them, and they did not ask. They stayed at the small inn above the bakery, where the beds were too short for Adrian and the roof creaked whenever the wind changed. The town watched them with suspicion at first. Then curiosity. Then, slowly, judgment of the practical kind. Kings mattered less when a fence needed mending. On the second morning, Adrian helped repair the schoolhouse gate after a hinge broke. He worked in silence beside the town carpenter, who treated him like any other tall man with useful hands. Caleb spent hours with the schoolteacher reviewing supply needs and left behind a plan written in plain language instead of royal nonsense. Julian sat with the clinic nurse and listened as she explained exactly why distant governments loved funding statues more than medicine. Elias watched from a distance, careful not to soften too quickly. Changed behavior was not proven by one apology. But he saw effort without performance, and that mattered. On the final evening, the 4 of them walked to a hill overlooking the valley. Autumn lights spread gold across the pines. For a while, none of them spoke. Caleb finally broke the silence. Were you happy here? Elias thought about lying to make the answer easier. Then he decided they had all survived enough dishonesty. I became happy here. Adrian stared at the valley. I am glad. Are you? Elias asked. Adrian's mouth tightened. No. But I am trying to become the kind of man who can be. Elias looked at him for a long moment. That answer, painful and imperfect, was more honest than any grand declaration. Julian sat in the grass, his crown left at the inn because Pine Hollow had no use for it. Do you think, he asked quietly, there is a version of another life where we did choose you? Elias looked toward the sunset. Yes. All 3 turned to him. He smiled sadly. And I hope those versions of us were happy. Julian bowed his head. Caleb wiped his eyes. Adrian closed his fist around nothing. Elias continued. But we are not those people. We are here. And here, I forgive you. The words moved through them like light entering a cracked room. Caleb whispered. You do? Yes, Elias said. I forgive you. I loved you. A part of me may always love you. But forgiveness is not a bridge back to the same life. Sometimes it is the road that lets everyone leave the ruins without carrying them forever. Adrian looked at him with eyes bright and devastated. Then what are we now? Elias thought about the question. Former lovers felt too small. Strangers felt too cruel. Family felt too easy. People who failed each other, he said at last, and chose not to let that failure be the last thing we became. The next morning, the kings prepared to leave. Pine Hollow gathered in the square, less because they adored royalty and more because they did not want to miss anything interesting. Elias stood near the schoolhouse with Anna holding his hand. Adrian approached first and offered the silver pin again. You do not have to wear it, he said. You do not have to keep it. But it belonged to you before we made it mean paying. Elias accepted it this time. The metal was warm from Adrian's hand. Thank you. Caleb handed Elias copies of the town charters, each signed but not named after any king. The school belongs to Pine Hollow, he said. So does the clinic funding. So do the road grants. Elias glanced through the papers and almost laughed. You finally learned how to write a policy a normal person can understand. Caleb's smile broke through tears. I had a good teacher. Julian gave Elias no document. No jewel. No symbol. He simply stepped forward and asked, May I hug you goodbye? Elias's heart twisted. The old Julian would have assumed. This Julian asked? Elias nodded. The embrace was gentle, brief, and heartbreaking in its restraint. When Julian stepped back, both of them were crying. Live well, Julian whispered. Elias answered, Rule well. The kings mounted their horses. Before they left, Adrian turned to the gathered townspeople. Pine Hollow protected someone precious when we failed to. The crowns will remember that. The baker called back. You had better. A ripple of laughter moved through the square, surprising even Adrian into a faint smile. Then the kings rode south. Elias watched until the road curved and the trees swallowed them from view. This time, no one was abandoned. This time, leaving was chosen honestly. Years passed. The kingdoms did not heal overnight, because real healing never obeys royal schedules. But they changed. The council was rebuilt with representatives from villages, schools, healers, merchants, and border towns. The Omega Protection Statute became one of the most studied laws in the United Realm. The phrase Heart of the Realm was no longer hidden in archives. It was taught as a warning that power without compassion eventually turns against the people it claims to serve. Adrian ruled the north with strength, but no longer worshipped hardness. He visited border families after storms and listened before giving orders. Soldiers still respected him. They respected him more because his courage had learned tenderness. Caleb transformed the East by changing how policy was written. Every major decree required public testimony from people affected by it. He still loved stars, but he no longer confused distance with devotion. In the observatory, he kept one empty chair by the window, not as punishment, but as remembrance. Julian became the most beloved king in the West not because he smiled easily again, but because his kindness grew roots. He funded clinics before monuments, schools before banquets, and gardens where common people could sit without permission. Once a year, on the anniversary of the coronation, the three kings met privately in the Grand Hall. They did not celebrate. They placed a white candle behind the thrones where Elias had once stood, and each read aloud one policy changed because of someone the old court had tried to erase. Some called it guilt. They knew better. It was accountability. As for Elias, he remained in Pine Hollow. The school grew from one leaning building into a bright stone academy with windows that caught the morning sun. Children from mountain villages came to learn there. Some were alphas. Some were betas. Some were omegas. None were taught that their worth depended on usefulness to power. Elias became known not as a hidden lord or a lost royal companion, but as Teacher Eli, the man who could explain history without making it boring and who kept extra biscuits in his desk for children who forgot breakfast. Letters arrived from the capital several times a year. Adrian wrote briefly but honestly, describing northern reforms and occasionally asking whether a difficult decision sounded too much like fear pretending to be wisdom. Caleb sent policy drafts with margins left wide, as if inviting Elias's old notes. Julian wrote about roses, clinics, festivals, and once, a child who had asked whether kings were allowed to make mistakes. Elias answered every letter, not always quickly, not always softly, but always truthfully. He never returned to live in the palace. He visited once, many years later, for the dedication of a public school built where the old council annex had been demolished. The grand hall had changed. By then, the thrones remained, but behind them stood a carved wall listing the names of farmers, teachers, healers, servants, builders, and ordinary citizens whose quiet work had shaped the kingdoms. At the center was a small silver rose surrounded by 3 stones. Elias stood before it for a long time. Adrian, Caleb, and Julian stood beside him, older now, steadier, humbled by years instead of broken by one mistake. "Does it hurt to be here?" Caleb asked quietly. Elias looked around the hall where he had once lost everything he thought he needed. Sunlight still poured through the stained glass. Bells still rang in the distance. But he was not the same person who had stood behind those thrones waiting to be chosen. "A little," he said. "But not enough to own me." Julian smiled through tears. Adrian looked at the silver rose and whispered, "You saved us." Elias shook his head. "No. Losing me forced you to save yourselves." They accepted that because it was true. Later, as Elias prepared to return to Pine Hollow, Anna, now grown and training to become a teacher herself, asked him whether the stories were true. Whether 3 kings had really loved him and lost him. Whether he had really forgiven them. Whether love could be real and still not return to what it was. Elias looked toward the palace gates, where the road opened toward the mountains. "Yes," he said. "Love can be real and still not be enough to erase harm. Forgiveness can be real and still choose distance. And people can fail terribly, then spend the rest of their lives becoming better than the moment that ruined them." Anna thought about that. "That sounds sad." Elias smiled. "It is. But it is also hopeful." The bells rang again as he left the capital, not like a goodbye this time, but like a memory finally learning how to rest. Behind him, 3 kings continued ruling with crowns that no longer sat heavier than their hearts. Ahead of him, Pine Hollow waited with its schoolhouse, its mountain winds, its ordinary mornings, and the peaceful life he had chosen for himself. Elias touched the silver pin in his pocket once, not with longing, but with gratitude for the person he had been and the person he had become. In the end, the crowns did cost the kings their omega. They lost the future they had once promised beneath stars, snow, and summer lanterns. But that loss did not become the end of the story. It became the wound that taught them how to rule, the mirror that taught them how to change, and the truth that taught Elias the meaning of freedom. Love was not proven by possession. Love was not proven by regret. Love was proven by the courage to protect another person's peace, even when that peace no longer included you. And because Elias finally chose himself, the kingdoms learned to choose compassion. That was how the heart of the realm saved them one last time, not by returning to the palace, but by showing 3 kings that the strongest love is the one that makes everyone more human after everything has fallen apart.